So now we're just looking at just how complicated and how chaotic we have to understand the Vietnam War was, especially when the American soldiers are just in absolute disarray when it comes to what's going on. Where the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh, remember, Viet Minh are the nationalists and the Viet Cong are the communist nationalists, they build these absolutely elaborate tunnel systems underground. So whether America is bombing the heck out of them or not, it's not necessarily very effective. And also, you have to remember you're in jungle terrain. So these guys could disappear underground very quickly. And the Americans are walking around doing what are called search and destroy missions, which is basically they're just going out in groups of 40 to 80 men, platoons, walking around trying to run into something or fight somebody. And it's not very logical approach at all, where the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh are living in these tunnel systems in these almost like underground cities, and they go under, they get bombed, they get pop back up, and they attack the Americans and go and disappear into the system. And you can see how amazing this tunnel system really is. They have ventilation systems, so they get oxygen in there. They have huge, they have traps, so that like if you don't know better, you're gonna fall. They have a water table where they can see how much water is collected, and they make sure the water moves away from their rooms. If you can see that to the bottom, and this is actually a typical Viet Cong map. They're showing how they look. And these guys, these two Americans are going into these holes. They would call them tunnel rats. And it's just amazing what these guys would have to do. They would sit there and have to take off all their gear except for basically like a flashlight and a pistol because you can't move around with a machine gun. And they had to crawl through these tunnels and try to run into somebody and not get killed first. It just absolutely horrible and scary job. Could you imagine like you're the guy that has to go crawl through the tunnels to keep the platoon safe? And you could just see this is like a war that's never been fought before by the United States. And it results again in the anti-war movement. And the anti-war movement and these stories that are coming back from Vietnam to America is turning more and more people against the war. And the fact that the US government is not telling the whole truth is complicating things. And every night you could see on TV how many people died, how many American soldiers died today. And it became this counting game where you just, and also I want you to really understand that this is really the first war where you could watch the war on television. We didn't just have pictures like the Civil War that started, and there was newsreels like World War II in Korea. But now you had on television, you had Vietnam War, and people didn't like war and what they saw. So as early as 1965, and this you had college professors and their students would lead what are called teach-ins, where students and teachers would walk out of class and discuss why they were against the war. Teach-ins were very much like sit-ins, and they were inspired by the African American leadership and what happened in North Carolina and the sit-ins. And you have to remember the sit-ins led to, which were again based on Mohandas Gandhi and these ideas of non-resistance and refusing to comply, led to sit-ins and teach-ins. And Satyagraha was something that inspired these ideas. And this is starting to intensify. And you can see how, I mean, that's such a powerful picture. You see this girl over the body of we don't know who is perished. A lot of innocent Vietnamese are getting killed and dying. And then these college courses, they're walking out. They're walking out for peace. They want the war to stop. And remember, originally at start, if you went to college, you didn't have to fight in the Vietnam War. Now, to make things even stronger and more on the anti-war movement, you have to understand that the civil rights movement in some ways emerges with the anti-war movement. Martin Luther King himself is critical. So what really ups the game is the draft. The draft, or the requirement of men to serve in Vietnam, and I say men, I mean only men, become unpopular because college students did not have to go if they're enrolled in college. However, everybody else did have to go. So you see that there's even a classism in the draft itself. If you're a wealthy American and mostly white, you went to college. You just avoided the draft altogether. Meanwhile, everybody else and poor white people and middle class white people that were maybe going to work at a factory or make cars in the Chrysler plant in Fenton or build a Ford out in Hazelwood, they're not going to go to college. That's a good job, and that's you might do what your dad did. Those guys aren't going to college. They're going to end up in Vietnam. And the draft is this random selection, and it starts with 18-year-olds, and they move up to 19-year-olds, 20, when they go up to 27. I believe 27 is the oldest you could be before you could be drafted as of now. And they're randomly just picking people by their names and numbers because they're supposed to not know who you are. It's supposed to be a very fair, random way if you just go to Vietnam or not. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was an opponent and a person against the war because African Americans made up 20% of the soldiers' deaths. And he makes a very important point. He says 1 out of 5 guys in Vietnam that die are black. Well, that doesn't make sense because 1 out of 5 Americans aren't black. So it's disproportionately white and Latinx and other people of color that are dying in the war over white soldiers. And also, you have to understand that less African Americans went to college, they still do, than white people, and less Latinx do. They still do. We've talked about that, how things have changed, have gotten better. But and back then, before the war, probably not that many people who went to college. Maybe 10%, something like that, went to college. Maybe it creeped up to 15% during the war. Now you have over 30% of Americans, probably close, moving starting to creep into 40% of Americans graduate college. That was not the case back then. There was other options, and college was for specialized things. I mean, you had to have the money to think like that to even go to college. And to some degree, you still do. And you can see how out of control the protests get and how the police get pretty aggressive, but also the protesters could get aggressive as well. It got really nasty. You look at this guy's picture on the bottom right, you just see how young these kids are. And I say that as a grown man. See an 18-year-old boy out in the middle of nowhere with machine guns and bazookas in a jungle, thousands of miles away from their country. It's not a good situation. We should know other famous people that were involved in the anti-war. You had Muhammad Ali refused to go to war. They took back some of his medals. He refused to go to Vietnam. He accepted jail time. A lot of people would go to jail. It was 2 years of service or 2 years in jail. Or they left and went to Canada. Many Americans left and went to Canada because they did not want to fight in Vietnam. They thought it was wrong, or they did not want to actually do it. They didn't believe in it. You can see Malcolm X was really good friends with Muhammad Ali. They're both black nationalist Muslims. And Ali took a stand, and it's very famous. And he makes arguments that we'll hopefully we'll have time to look at in class. Now, some other things that happen is we'll do this in class. Now, there's two groups that they would label you. In 1968, the U.S. was divided into 2 main points of view, and we've used these terms. These terms apply to other wars too. But if you're a hawk or a dove, really matter. A hawk is somebody that insists that we stay and fight in Vietnam until America won the war. Those were hawks. And doves wanted the United States to leave Vietnam and end the war. Now, I would argue that a lot of times hawks tended to be more conservative in culture. However, hawks weren't necessarily all Republicans. That's where the lines blur. Democrats could be hawks too. Johnson was a Democrat, and he was a hawk, obviously, where, Republicans could argue against. They could be doves. They could be against the war. And there's a very famous picture of the bottom left-hand corner. The girl is sitting there, and they have bayonets, and they're protesting peacefully. And the girl is just holding a flower peacefully, and they have a bayonet in her face. You just see the violence and the aggression. And they're asking for the end of war in Indochina. They used to call the area of Vietnam Indochina, the region. But hawks and doves have existed. It's just in World War II, there were doves, but nothing like Vietnam. In World War I, there were doves, but nothing like Vietnam. Vietnam has many doves. And you can see the guys are holding hands regardless of race. And a lot of young people are against the war, especially. The older generations trusted the war probably more because of World War II. They thought the government was doing it to contain communism. But the younger crowds were not so sure. And the mistrust of the government, like the My Lai massacre, had caused a lot of these problems. They've caused this mistrust. Now, one thing that kind of showed how this war could go was the Tet Offensive. So Tet is a very important holiday in Vietnamese culture. Very important. And what happens on Tet in January of 1968? It's like their New Year's, the Vietnamese New Year's. The guerrillas led an attack called Tet Offensive, and this is supposed to be like such an important day that the Vietnamese and the Americans are gonna have a ceasefire basically. But actually, what happens is the opposite. The Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh they led an amazing military success attack where they collaborated and they attacked all the American military bases in southern cities like Saigon at the exact same time. They almost timed it exactly, and this went on for 4 weeks. They kept attacking these bases. They would run trucks into the doors and try to get troops in there, and the Americans have to shoot them down. And ultimately, in the end, the Americans they won. They repelled and they kicked back the North Vietnamese attacks. There was some deaths on the American side. There's a lot more on the North Vietnamese side. However, what it showed to Americans and it showed to the U.S. military is they had really underestimated their enemy. These guys could coordinate an all-out attack on the south of Vietnam, a sneak attack essentially, and the Americans were not prepared and they underestimated these guys quite a bit. So it just scared the heck out of the soldiers too, that they didn't know what was coming next. And that shook us. And when this got back to America, this showed that we weren't playing ball with somebody that just didn't know what they're doing. And maybe some of this was because of superiority. Like Americans thought we were the best, and our army was unstoppable, especially after World War II. And even Korea, they protected the South. In World War One, we won. We've been winning for quite a while. There's no way we could lose this war. And this kind of showed our vulnerability. And also, I would say, argue maybe there was some racism there that they thought they were superior to the Vietnamese. And this again showed that they're underestimating their enemy quite a bit and what they're fighting for and how they understood the terrain. So ultimately, General Westmoreland, the guy in the bottom left-hand corner, the guy in charge of the forces at the time, requested another additional 200,000 troops to add to his force of 500,000 in Vietnam. And this is important because the U.S. public view changed, and they believed there was no way the war could be won. Even though we won the Tet Offensive, they turned on the generals and they said, no, this is done. You have 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. You want another 200,000, and they could attack us like this? This is too much. It's time to get out of Vietnam. And people started to turn even more hawkish and more conservative people started to turn against the war itself. So now this also led in a lot of ways to help the end of Johnson's presidency. President Johnson announced that he would not run for a third term in office. He says, I'm done. He inherited the office because Kennedy was assassinated. And his approach to Vietnam was that, was obviously the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and he sent a draft. He thought we could win this war and stop the spread of communism. That didn't work. And now this up and coming guy, Robert Kennedy, who is John F. Kennedy's brother, who was also the attorney general under his brother, is a Democrat, very progressive. You could see him. He was good, actually friends with Martin Luther King. His speeches are considered one of the reasons that African Americans and people calmed down after assassination of Martin Luther King. And he had been seen as like this shining light in America, that he could be president and unify people based on race and bring the country back. And he was assassinated. Sirhan walks up to him while he's running for president of the United States in a hotel in California, and the guy kills him. And the reason the guy killed him is an Arab nationalist, and he was upset about the pro-Israel remarks that Kennedy had made. He had supported the Israelis. And this just seems like a time of no hope. Martin Luther King is dead. Kennedy is dead. What is going on? Vietnam's completely out of control. And presidents and to make things even worse, another guy enters the race. George Wallace is the governor of Alabama, and you can see him in the bottom right corner with the Confederate flag. Would run as an independent on the idea of going back to segregation and Jim Crow laws. So after Brown versus Board, he wanted to put the schools back into segregation, and he says, if you vote for me, I'm going to put America back to what it was before Brown versus Board and the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement. And what he does ultimately is he takes a lot of votes away from the Republicans and some conservatives in the South. But Richard Nixon, this new Republican candidate, he would win on the idea he's going to end the war. and restore order. So he's going to be a law and order Republican. I'm going to bring America back together. I'm going to get us out of Vietnam, and things are going to go well. Trust me.